Chapter 1 introduces us to several of the early civilizations that we know of. In fact, it starts with the prehistory, before there was any written history era, and kind of works its way through. I wanted to draw particular attention just to the Hebrews, the Israelites, or what we call now the Jews. And so this lecture will just focus in solely on the Hebrews. And I'll attempt to give a history of the Hebrews starting from their origin and discuss their sacred texts as well as some of their theology. And, of course, their contribution to Western culture. Now, the Hebrews originated in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is actually just a Greek word that means land between two rivers. And those two rivers are, in fact, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Hebrews migrated to Canaan, a portion of which was later called Palestine. The Hebrew patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were chieftains of a semi-nomadic clan. Their clans were semi-nomadic, and they roamed Palestine, and occasionally they journeyed into Mesopotamia and Egypt. The early Hebrews absorbed some features of Mesopotamian civilization. For example, there are parallels between biblical law and the Mesopotamian legal tradition. As we looked at the Code of Hammurabi, we were able to see there was some very similar ethical traditions in that law as what we see in the Hebrew law. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of kind of a crude Hebrew history, and it's not complete. It's not totally 100% thorough, and I'm sure you could spend quite a bit of time discussing this. In fact, they teach entire courses over this sort of history. So, just to kind of make the disclaimer, this isn't going to be exhaustive. This is going to be kind of a sweep across most of what we can identify as the history of the Hebrew people. And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, but I guess it's not that unfortunate, but what we know about who the Hebrews were comes mostly from the Old Testament, as we call it. It's not old to them. It's the Testament, I guess you would say. But the history of the Hebrew people doesn't exist in any great detail apart from what we have in the Bible. And so, a lot of people question the integrity of those sources as whether they are actually reliable or not. But that it does contain a lot of information. I'll attempt to kind of give you a little bit of a summary of what we would find in there. But the story of the Hebrews, as is found in the Torah, which consists of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, tells the story of Abraham. He was a shepherd from Ur. God calls him, makes a covenant with him, and promises him an offspring to be the father of a great nation of God's chosen people who will become the Israelites. The laws and the history of the Hebrew people are found in the Torah, which is part of what we now call the Tanakh. The Tanakh is basically the Old Testament. At some point during the early history of Rabbinic Judaism, there were, different understandings, and there emerged a tripartite Hebrew Bible known as the Hebrew acronym Tanakh, which stands for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and so you add the vowel sounds in between, because there's actually no vowel sounds in Hebrew, and so we add them in there. So Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, and then you put T-A-N-A-K, and you've got Tanakh. And so that is the Pentateuch, the prophets, and the writings, are what those Hebrew words stand for. The God of the Hebrews is Yahweh. His name is typically represented in the form of a tetragram. The tetragrammaton is H, or as when we add the vowel sounds in, we have Yahweh. But tetragrammaton is just a fancy Greek word that literally means four-letter word. So tetra for four, grammaton, so four-letter. And so in the Hebrew, that would consist of four letters that are Hebrew characters: Yod, He, Va, He. This name is actually the name given to Moses. It's not given to Abraham. It actually is given to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. If you know the story of Moses standing before God in the burning bush, and he says, I am that I am. He says, that is his name. But in Exodus 3:15, this statement is made to Moses by God, according to the text. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations. Now, we translate, as I say we, is in English speakers, we translate the word Yahweh as Lord, typically, in the text. Now, the reason this is it's kind of a token of reverence. The Jewish people tend to be very reverent concerning the name of God, and they do not consider it, acceptable to misuse or, in a sense, blaspheme the name of God. And so there was, even today you can see a bit of this in some modern Jews. Whenever they write God in English, they just put G-D. Now, part of that is, of course, because of the absence of vowel sounds, but it's also in a bit of reverence to the name of God. But Yahweh would be his personal first name, so to speak, which would be what would separate Yahweh from Ashtoreth or Moloch or some other god. Now, one very distinct quality of the Hebrew people was their monotheism. Hebrew monotheism became the religion of God's chosen people, Israel. As the chosen people, their chief duty was to maintain the worship of Yahweh as he demanded. That worship was embodied in the 10 Commandments, or what we might call the Decalogue, which forbade the Hebrews to steal, murder, lie, or commit adultery, among other things. The covenant was a constant force in Hebrew life. And so part of the covenant between God and man, the humankind, or the Israelites, to be more specific, was that if they kept the law, then God would bless them. In fact, the Torah outlines many other covenants as well. Just to name a few, we've got the Adamic, which would be with Adam, covenant, the Noahic covenant, which would be with Noah, the Abrahamic, the Mosaic, and those are just a few. And there are others, the Davidic covenant with King David. And the uniqueness of the Hebrews' religion can be seen by comparing the essence of this Hebrew monotheism with the religious outlook of the Mesopotamians. Whereas the Mesopotamians considered their gods capricious, the Hebrews believed that their God would protect them and make them prosper if they obeyed his commandments. The Jews felt that magicians, witches, astrologers, and soothsayers harmfully and wrongfully usurped the powers that properly belonged to Yahweh. Much of the early Hebrew history, as it is found in the Bible, is the chronicling of the Hebrew people's pursuit of the Promised Land, essentially the pursuit of crossing the Jordan into what God has promised them. And so as the story goes, Joseph, the son of Isaac, makes his way to Egypt through being sold into slavery by his brothers. And since Joseph is the son of Isaac, that makes him actually the grandson of Abraham, who the covenant was initially made with. And we call them patriarchs, in case you didn't know, that these that we refer to, Isaac, Jacob, Abraham, those are considered to be the fathers of Judaism, the patriarchs. The lands in Egypt, where Joseph ends up, he ends up in Egypt, where he's been sold into slavery, but he actually becomes kind of a well-to-do figure in Egyptian society, according to the story. And in due time, his family eventually comes to Egypt, and there's kind of an exchange between Joseph and his brothers and his father and his brother Benjamin, and they end up all coming to Egypt. And eventually the Israelites are well received in Egypt, as the story goes, and then the Pharaoh who likes them is no longer in charge, and then you have another Pharaoh who steps into place who doesn't like them, and basically the Israelites end up becoming the slaves of the Egyptians. Um, and so we've got Moses in Exodus, which comes along as he's appointed by God, as we just talked about a second ago concerning the name of God. Moses is appointed to go and liberate the Israelites and take them to the promised land. Now, there's a lot of interesting debate surrounding this Exodus, and many scholars of the Hebrew Bible have, in the last decade, really begun to question the historical accuracy of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt. The reason for the rejection of the Exodus tradition is said to be a lack of historical and archaeological evidence in Egypt. Those advancing these claims, however, are not typically specialists in the study of Egyptian history, culture, and archaeology. As one man said, this scholar James Hoffmeyer, he examines the most current Egyptological evidence and argues that it actually supports the biblical record concerning Israel in Egypt. And he's not alone in this. In fact, there are other sources that acknowledge the mention of the Israelites in ancient Egyptian archaeology. One scholar notes that Israel began as a Shasu or Bedouin-type people, referred to for the first time in a certain Egyptian text called the Merneptah stele. In time, the people moved into the central hill country of Canaan. The first settlements there are of an elliptical type, suggesting their desert origins. We also note that these people abstained from eating pig. In fact, they did an examination of some areas where they thought maybe Israelites had lived in Egypt, and they found no pig bones. And so that was they thought to be quite a red flag that some type of people existed here that abstained from eating pork, and that is normal practice within Judaism. As time passed, Israelites must have shifted from kind of a tribal lifestyle to a monarchy. In fact, we have evidence of two monarchies, one in the south called Judah with its capital in Jerusalem, whose royal line seems to have descended from the founding dynasty named David, and one in the north called Israel with its capital in Samaria, whose royal line seems to have descended from the founding dynasty named Omri. The worship of the deity named Yahweh shines through at every instance. Now, after Moses leads the people out of Egypt, they spend 40 years wandering around the wilderness, as the story goes. It's in this time that Moses obtains the law from Yahweh on Mount Sinai. The people make it to the promised land eventually. They cross the Jordan. Moses dies. Joshua succeeds Moses, and he is kind of a great warrior leader. The Israelites begin a quest of taking land from the current inhabitants in a series of wars. Then Saul is appointed king. David becomes king. Solomon becomes king, builds the first temple. The temple's destroyed. The Israelites go into a Babylonian captivity. Then under King Cyrus of Babylon, the second temple and wall is rebuilt in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, this is definitely a kind of crude history, as I said, but I do want to also draw attention to the role of the prophets. The prophets in the Tanakh are classified sometimes as lesser and greater, not because of any qualitative reason, but rather due to their length. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible are Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, which we consider major because they're very long texts, and then we have Hosea, Amos, Micah, Joel, Obadiah, Jonah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Two important aspects of the Old Testament scriptures can be traced to what we call these writing prophets. Now, what was so significant about these prophets is that they wrote their prophecies down. And so such a tremendous amount of the Jewish philosophy and prophecies were preserved because these prophets wrote down what they prophesied. And two things that they did that were very significant. One is that groups of prophets such as these and their disciples were responsible for the preservation and guardianship of the Mosaic Pentateuch. A recurring themes in the Old Testament books is the role of the prophets in giving the Mosaic scriptures to Israel. Second, it was likely that these prophets who were most responsible for the composition of the Old Testament books and the Old Testament as a whole, that they also may have been responsible for the second edited version of the Pentateuch, which is actually what we have in our possession now, and that we call that the Hebrew Bible. And so, part of this scribal prophetic tradition, these prophets were the ones who were probably handling the texts of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, and putting it together in such a fashion as to be able to preserve it. And of course, no discussion of the Hebrews is complete without discussing their wisdom literature. The wisdom books in the Hebrew Bible are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And there are some other wisdom literature texts that are what we consider part of the apocryphal texts, kind of an intertestamental period where these texts were preserved. And if you have a Catholic version of the Holy Bible, you will typically have the apocryphal books in there. But in most Protestant circles, there are no apocryphal texts included in the canon, so to speak. But those works of wisdom literature are extremely important to Judaism. Now, the association of the Hebrew sages with the royal court is an extremely important aspect of this tradition, because Israel's successful participation in the international community as God's light to the nations depended on sound and godly leadership. The wise men, as they would be referred to, were charged with the responsibility of, instructing royal officials in the way of wisdom. And in fact, we attribute the writing of Ecclesiastes to Solomon, and we attribute the writing of Proverbs and the Song of Solomon is this wisdom literature that would have come from a king, tradition says. The wise men were charged with the responsibility of instructing royal officials, administrators and leaders, and encouraging them to model godly character and behavior. The influence of wisdom was also important to Hebrew kingship for bringing a sense of balance and perspective to the economic structure of Hebrew society, protecting the rights of the poor and the needy. In fact, that's kind of a reoccurring theme throughout the Hebrew Bible, talking about widows and orphans, and sort of this idea that the Hebrew royalty, the kingship, their authority, they should look out for the least of these, kind of the way to say it. It's even possible that the instructions of the wisdom literature were used to supplement the religious reforms of the godly kings of Judah. The practice of wisdom held reciprocal benefits for both Hebrew kingship and Hebrew society. The rule of the king was made more secure by the instruction, instilling respect for parental and royal authority, while the quality of life for Hebrew citizens was improved as the king enacted principles of righteousness and justice. So, from the wanderings of Abraham and Canaan through the liberation from Egypt wrought by Moses to the Israelite resettlement of Canaan under Joshua, what we're reading in the Bible are oral tales, okay? They were collected and they were edited for the first time probably in the 10th century during and after the kingship of David. The last books to be taken into the canon of the Hebrew Bible belong to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, and these would be Esther and Ecclesiastes, 3rd century, and Daniel in the 2nd century. And one thing we cannot escape, though, is the contribution of Judaism to Western culture. There was an author by the name of Thomas Cahill, and he wrote a book called How a Tribe of Desert Nomads Changed the Way Everyone Thinks and Feels. And I think he captures something pretty, adamantly in that statement, because, we can't get away from really this ethical monotheism in our culture. It's been embedded, and Christianity took the whole foundation of the Old Testament, of what they call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, this ethical monotheism, and they embraced it and ran with it, and it became the basis for much of the way the Western world formed its ideas about ethics. Now, other ethical codes have come and gone, while other ethical codes have given away to the fad of the moment, as one author said. Judaism ethical code ethical monotheism has endured, as the Jews believe, because it comes from God, the Creator and the Commander. Now, whether or not it really came from God or not is left up to us as individuals to decide, but one thing is for certain, it certainly has endured. And there's just something really fascinating. I think one other author I can recall said one thing he found very persuasive about the Jewish people was that, we see Jews, but we don't see any Hittites or any Amorites. We look to, we don't see any of these other ancient people existing, but miraculously, really, even in the face of persecution and the Holocaust, even in the face of the medieval torture and murder and execution of Jews throughout Christianity in the Middle Ages and Dark Ages, somehow, some way, we still have a nation of Israel. We still have people who identify themselves as Jews and are practicing Jews, and not to mention, like I said, their ethical codes have been ingrained into the way the Western world has perceived what is considered right and wrong, if not due to simply just the moral code found in the Ten Commandments. And so there you have it, just a closer look at just the Hebrew people, a little bit about their society, their history, their belief system, a little bit of their theology, and what I would say most importantly, their contribution to Western culture.